You heard Father Tulani read in our hearing the scripture for tonight from the 34th chapter of the book of Deuteronomy. In the New International Version, selected verses of that passage are as follows. Then Moses climbed Mount Nebo from the plains of Moab to the top of Pisgah across from Jericho. There the Lord showed him the whole land. And the Lord said to him, verse 4, this is the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, when I said, I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you will not cross over into it. And Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab as the Lord had said. Verse 8, the Israelites grieved for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days until the time of weeping and mourning was over. Now Joshua, son of Nun, was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands on him. So the Israelites listened to Joshua and did what the Lord had commanded Moses. Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, who did all those signs and wonders the Lord sent him to do in Egypt to Pharaoh and to all his officials and to his whole land. For no one has ever shown the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of all Israel. Would you repeat these words after me? The Israelites grieved for Moses in the plains of Moab for 30 days until the time of weeping and mourning was over. I want you to pray with me tonight on the theme, Let Us March On. In the story of the people of Israel, Moses' name looms large as a prophetic leader without peer. The chronicler describes him in verses 10 through 12 of Deuteronomy 34 as a prophet like no other prophet. No other prophet had stood up to an oppressive government face to face and not only told the commander-in-chief of an undefeated imperial army that what you are doing is wrong and against the will of God. God did not create people to be slaves. God did not create one race to be subservient to some other race, nor did God create one race to be masters over some other race. That is a combination of human arrogance and human ignorance, which is diametrically opposed to divine providence. God is not pleased, and God says, let my people go. No other prophet had done that. No other prophet had inspired his or her people to participate in their own liberation, to do something to set themselves free from a slave mentality and an enslaved reality. No other prophet had engaged in violence in an attempt to show the oppressor that you can't just do any old thing you want to do to the oppressed and think everybody's going to go along to get along. There are some of us who are not only not going to take it, but there's some of us who will also take you out. Read Exodus 2, verse 12. Some of us will not bury our feelings of hopeless frustration. Some of us will bury you in the sand on which you stand. No other prophet before or since Moses had written their name boldly in blood across the pages of Israel's history like the prophet Moses. Moses was a prophetic leader without peer, educated in the finest schools of Kemet, a member of a despised race, but trained in the oppressor's top-flight educational institutions. Moses was brilliant, bold, brash, and a bad mammy jamma. But the text says that Moses was dead, and the people grieved for Moses until the time of weeping and mourning was over. Now, juxtapose this biblical narrative with a contemporary narrative and let the parallels speak for themselves. In the story of the people of South Africa, Mandela's name looms large as a political leader without peer. His biography shows him to be a South African leader like no other South African leader. No other black man had stood up to an oppressive, racist white Afrikaner government face to face and lived to tell about it, much less write about it. Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela was born of Tembu royalty in Kunu, and he dared to stand up in a white court while he was on trial with a white prosecutor, a white judge, and all the symbols of white apartheid power, and put the government on trial. No other Tembu from Kunu had dared to do that. No other black South African leader before or since Madiba had written his name boldly in blood across the pages of South African history like the first elected black president, Mandela. Educated in the finest schools in Johannesburg, a practicing attorney in Johannesburg in partnership with Oliver Tambo, a founding member of Umkhonto weSizwe, MK. Rolihlahla says in his own words, and I quote, "I do not deny that I planned sabotage. I did not plan it in a spirit of recklessness, nor because I have any love of violence. I planned it as a result of a calm and sober assessment of the political situation that had arisen after many years of tyranny, exploitation, and oppression of my people by the whites." He sounds like Moses in Exodus 2. I admit immediately, says Mandela, that I was one of the persons who helped to form Umkhonto weSizwe. I deny that Umkhonto was responsible for a number of acts which clearly fell outside the policy of the organization and which have been charged in the indictment against us. Nelson Mandela gave this statement in a trial when he, as a convicted prisoner, serving a 5-year sentence for leaving the country without a permit and for inciting people to go on strike at the end of May 1961, a prisoner captured only because our CIA tipped off the South African police as to where he was, where he would be, and where he was headed, posing as a chauffeur. You won't hear much reporting about the United States involvement and the CIA involvement in Mandela's arrest and imprisonment, as the nostalgic fairy tale news talks about Mandela's incredible willingness to forgive. You won't hear that, nor in all of the furor of Fox News and the Lipton teabag folk over President Obama's shaking the hand of Raul Castro. Will you hear anything about the irony of that handshake in light of the U.S. prison still operating on Castro's Island in Cuba? Nelson Mandela said, as a convicted prisoner brought from prison to testify in the trial at Rivonia, quote, "I and others who started Umkhonto weSizwe felt that without violence there would be no way open to the African people to succeed in their struggle against the principle of white supremacy. All lawful modes of expressing oppression to this principle have been closed by legislation." This is a lawyer speaking. "And we were placed in a position," Mandela said, "in which we had either to accept a permanent state of inferiority or to defy the government. We chose to defy the law." Sounds just like Moses, doesn't it? Rolihlahla said, "We first broke the law in a way which avoided any recourse to violence when this form was legislated against, and then the government resorted to a show of force to crush opposition in its policies. Only then did we decide to answer violence with violence." A carbon copy of Moses' behavior in the 2nd chapter of the book of Exodus. No other political leader before or since Mandela, Robert Sobukwe, Walter Sisulu, Chris Hani, Terra Lakota, Thabo Mbeki, Jacob Zuma, Albert Lutuli, Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, Alan Buzak, Desmond Tutu. No other political leader before or since Mandela had written their name boldly in blood across the pages of South African history like the political leader Madiba. Mandela was a political leader without peer, as Moses was a prophetic leader without peer. Mandela was brilliant, bold, brash, and a bad mammy jamma. But tonight's texts say that Mandela is dead, and we find ourselves grieving for Mandela. This is a time for weeping, and this is a time of mourning, as described in Deuteronomy 34, verse 8. The Israelites grieved for Moses, just as we grieve for Mandela. And the period of grief, with all of its stages of grief, requires us to do several things, just as the people in this biblical passage did. Grieving requires us to remember. The Israelites remembered the fascinating and phenomenal story of Moses' life and leadership, and they told it to their children and their grandchildren. How, if it had not been for the women in Moses' life and the women in their lives, there would have been no Moses and there would have been no them. Shiphrah and Puah, two women, went against the genocidal plot of the government to destroy all black boys of Hebrew descent. Two women defied the government and saved the lives of little black Hebrew boys. Two Egyptian women. That's what I preached for 36 years as a pastor. And that's what the white media missed in trying to use me to keep Barack out of their White House. I preached, everybody, your color ain't your kind. That's number one. Number two, everybody not your color is not your enemy. Two Egyptian women protected and preserved the lives of Hebrew baby boys. If it don't be for the women, there don't be no us. They told the fascinating and phenomenal story of Moses' life and leadership to their children and their grandchildren. They remembered. They told his story and of the women in his story, Jochebed and Miriam, his mama and her mother wit, his sister and her quick thinking, his wife Zipporah and her obedience to God. They remembered in their grieving. They even told of his family's secrets, his pitch black Nubian wife, Zipporah, and how his sister and his brother had a problem with that. Don't think that this color consciousness mess started in the 500 years of white supremacy we live in. They remembered family secrets during their grieving. They remembered the good stuff and they remembered the bad stuff. They remembered the violence of Exodus 2, and they remembered the CIA partnering with the president to put Moses on the government's Tuesday morning kill list. We're talking about President Pharaoh. We're talking about the CIA, which is the Cairo intelligence agency. The Uncle Tom undercover agent who ran and tricked on Moses. They remembered every aspect. They remembered every event in Moses' sensational sojourn from a mountain in Midian to Mount Sinai, the tablets and his temper, the good stuff and the bad stuff. From Mount Sinai in Exodus 19 to Mount Nebo in Deuteronomy 34. In their period of grieving, they remembered. And we, during this period of grieving for Madiba, we are required to remember. We are required to remember the fascinating and phenomenal story of Mandela's life from Kunu in Transkei to a presidential palace in Gauteng. And in remembering, we must recount the whole story, not just the rose-colored aspects of fictionalized South African history culminating in a jointly shared Nobel Peace Prize. We must recall, recount, and rehearse the whole story, the good stuff and the bad stuff. And like the Israelites remembering the story of Moses, maybe a good place for us to start is with the women. Livingston already started it. Mosley Brown said it before him. If it don't be for the women, if it don't be for Medea, it don't be no Madiba. Nelson was first married, yet her name hadn't been called yet, to Evelyn Ntoke Mase. And they were married for 13 years. They had children. Kohishlashla was then married to Winnie Madikizela for 38 years. And for 27 of those years, he was incarcerated. For the last 13 years, he had been married to Graça Machel, but that marriage was post-apartheid. Who became the face of the struggle for the 27 years Madiba was in prison? A woman, Winnie Madikizela Mandela, this strong black woman, this leading force in the ANC while her mate was incarcerated, this black giant in the struggle for freedom from liberation and an end to apartheid. Winnie says, and I quote Winnie, she says, quote, "Black women are discriminated against. White supremacy is one level of discrimination, but there are other levels. Black women," says Winnie, "have to contend with male prejudice fed by patriarchal notions. They suffer abuse from white women who are also beneficiaries of white supremacy. At the same time," says Winnie, "black women are expected to be in solidarity with their male folk to fight racial oppression. In this regard, black women have little choice. They cannot sit on the sideline and watch the black male being reduced to an endangered species. After all, these black men are the fathers of their children. They're their lovers and they're their sons. In short, there is no other species that understands oppression as well as black women do." 2 years before Evelyn Massey and Kolishlashla Mandela were divorced, the importance and the centrality of women in the freedom struggle, the fight against apartheid, have been capsulized in the phrase, Consul General, I would try to pronounce it, Watent Abafazi, Watene Makodo, which means now you have touched the women, you have struck a rock. In memory of the women who marched in 1956 to protest against apartheid. In Pretoria, 20,000 women from all racial backgrounds came from all over South Africa to march on the Union building to protest the past laws for African women. They brought 100,000 signatures to the Prime Minister protesting the racism of apartheid in general and the racism of the passbook in particular. Women understand oppression. Yet, we keep telling the story of the struggle against apartheid, the struggle against Egyptian oppression and Exodus, the struggle against European and British oppression in the Black Atlantic, and the struggle against oppression in the Civil Rights Movement, the struggle against lynching, lynch parties, and tea parties. We keep telling that story as if the women were and are invisible. We've got to tell the whole story, the good stuff and the bad stuff. We cannot tell the story of blacks in the U.S. diaspora and omit Reverend Jarena Lee, Reverend Janet Wilson, Septima Clark, Harriet Tubman, Ida B. Wells, Daisy Bates, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Mamie Till, just to name a few. We cannot tell the story of Africans struggling against oppression in Ghana and omit the name of Ya Asante. We cannot tell the story of African struggle against oppression in Angola and omit the name of Queen Nzinga. Nor can we tell the story of South African struggle against the ugliness of apartheid and omit the name of Winnie Madikizela Madiba. We cannot tell the story of Kohishlashla fight against apartheid and not include the contributions of Winnie. Remembering means to recall, to recount, and to rehearse the whole story. how Madiba was shaped and influenced by Steve Biko and the Black Consciousness Movement, how Madiba reacted to the Kairos document when the church in South Africa stood up and spoke out against the heresy of apartheid, and even went so far as to say maybe violence is the only language racists in power can understand. Now, when Frederick Douglass said in the 19th century that power concedes nothing without a demand, it never has and never will, almost nobody noticed, nobody cared. Who was Douglass? A backdoor guest at the White House at best and a runaway slave at worst? The first part of Douglass's quote is even scarier. Here's the quote in its entirety. Douglass said, "Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are people who want crops without plowing the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the roar of its mighty waters. The struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, or it may be both, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will." One black man saying that in the 19th century could be ignored. But with Umkhonto we Sizwe saying that in the 20th century, and then the church, black, white, and colored Christians chiming in with the Kairos document that did not say no to violence, racists' only recourse was to label it as communist. That's communist inspired. White racists find it impossible to believe that black folks can think a thought without that thought being given to them by a white man or woman. Read Nelson Mandela's statement, "An ideal for which I am prepared to die." Remembering means recalling, recounting, and rehearsing, telling the whole story. Grieving requires us to remember, and it also calls us to reflect. But before segueing into reflection, an important part of the remembering process for Israelites in this text and for South Africans in our time is remembering the community. Moses was a part of a covenant community. Moses was not the Lone Ranger. He was a part of a community. God made a covenant with a community, not with an individual. God responded to the cries of an oppressed community. Moses was just a spokesman for a season for that community. And the community was called on to do some things for itself as they became partners with God in their own liberation. Go back and read the closing verses of Exodus 2 and the call of Moses in Exodus 3. The community cried for help to God. Their cries, the chronicler writes, went up to God. God heard the cries of the community, and God responded to the condition of the community. God, in fact, told Moses, "I have seen the misery of my people," the community. "I have heard the community crying out because of their slavery and their slave drivers. I am concerned about the suffering of the community, and I have come down to rescue the community from the hands and the heels of the oppressor. So you go tell Pharaoh, I said, let my people go." This ain't about you, Moses. This is about a covenant community. As the Israelites grieved, they remembered and they reflected. As South Africans grieve, and as persons of all faiths and persons of no faith grieve the loss of this giant called Madiba, we remember and we reflect. Madiba was part of a community in Zulu and Xhosa, Ubuntu. The Ubuntu, the community engaged in the Defiance campaign. The Ubuntu, the community was called on to do some things for itself as they became partners with God in their own liberation. The Ubuntu, the community was impacted by the Sharpeville massacre in 1960. The Ubuntu, the community was affected by the bannings and the ANC leadership going into exile. Not all of them were on Robben Island. Most were in exile in Namibia, in Mozambique, in Angola, in Zimbabwe, and in Europe. The community, the Ubuntu, suffered when Hector Peterson and 300 plus children were murdered, mowed down, massacred in Soweto in 1976. Nelson Mandela was in prison in 1976, but the blood of the children was in the streets of Soweto in 1976. The Ubuntu suffered. The community felt that blow deeply and personally, and the Ubuntu responded. Most of us who sit here in this sanctuary in Chicago are a part of the African diaspora, an African descended diaspora. We were not in Sharpeville in 1960. We were not in Soweto in 1976, nor were we in Marikana in 2012. In Marikana, where capitalism trumped community and privatization triumphed over liberation. We sympathized, we empathized, and we did what we could do back then in the fight against apartheid, engaging in the divestment campaign, protesting at South African embassies, and joining Randall Robinson, Prexy Nesbitt in providing material support. But those who are citizens of South Africa, the members of the Lesedi, Tswana, Sotho, Xhosa, and Zulu, even Venda, Ubuntu, they know personally and painfully what they suffered and what their families suffered existentially. My personal introduction to the community, to the Ubuntu under Afrikaner oppression, came about through my relationship with Reverend Bonganjala Goba of Durban, Reverend Tanda Ngobo of KwaZulu-Natal, Dr. Elkin Sutoli, who taught us Shosholoza Kulezontaba in 1975, Funeka Shishlale, our member, Dr. Alan Buzak in the later years, Bishop Ndungani. Chief Albert Lutuli was a deacon in one of our local UCC churches in Groutville. I asked Lisa the name of her school because our denomination started a high school for black girls, Inanda Seminary in KwaZulu-Natal in 1853. Our congregation supported the ANC. We also supported the PAC, which our country called communists. We supported the United Democratic Fund. We paid the salaries for the entire staff of Inanda Seminary at Christmas time for 2 straight years in a row. We were connected to that Ubuntu. Our relationship to that Ubuntu under oppression was much more than a Trans-Africa sign that said Free South Africa on the front lawn of our church. Our relationship was sealed by the blood of relatives and our members. Our relationship was also sealed by the blood of the Lamb, whose spirit guided the hands of those who wrote the Kairos document, guided the hands of those who wrote the Freedom Charter, and also guided the hands of those who served in the Umkhonto weSizwe. The struggle was not just Moses' struggle. He was the spokesman for a covenantal community. The struggle was not just Mandela's struggle. He was the spokesman for a people bound together by Ubuntu, a community. They participated in that struggle as a community while Madiba was locked away as a convict. And just a quick sidebar before moving to my conclusion, as an outsider, as an African American, not a South African, I never will forget how Madiba handed an American news commentator his lunch after apartheid was over. After the first election in the history of the country of South Africa, when black South Africans were allowed to vote, after the iconic giant, the man whose name looms large as a South African political leader without peer, after Rolihlahla Mandela moved from a prison cell to a presidential suite, while visiting the United States, he was being interviewed, and I think it was Ted Koppel who interviewed him. And he was asked, Madiba was asked to explain his visit with Fidel Castro and his embrace of and friendship with Fidel Castro, one whom we have labeled as an enemy of the United States. And Madiba gave the interviewer both a history lesson and a perspective, a black South African perspective that the interviewer had never considered. First, Madiba pointed out to him that while my people were hungry and sick, Castro sent food and Cuban doctors. Your country sent the military. Your country sent arms and support for the racist South African government. When the ANC was in exile, Madiba said, especially in Angola, your country supported the South African troops trying to topple a democratically elected government. And Cuba sent black troops to support democracy to beat back the racist forces operating in somebody else's country. Then he said, with his soft but stern voice, don't try to make your enemies our enemies. And don't presume to tell us who our friends are. Their awesome actions speak louder than your empty words. Black folk and white folk, coloreds and Indians cheered that response, and I was right there with them. Yes! From the man who said, before you can forgive your enemies, you need to defeat your enemies. And you don't let others tell you, especially your enemies, who your friends and allies are in your struggle for freedom. Grieving requires us to remember. Grieving also requires us to reflect. Upon reflection, the Moses on Mount Nebo was not the same as the Moses on the backside of a mountain in Midian when he first saw a bush on fire and not on fire all at the same time. Moses had changed. In fact, Moses went through several stages of change in his 40 years of leadership. A change from an endangered infant to an entitled teenager. A change from a residence in Pharaoh's palace to a fugitive from the criminal justice system. A change from an important monarch to an impulse murderer. A change from a shepherd tending his father-in-law's sheep to a prophet on an assignment from God. A change from leading a liberated people across a sea on dry land to leading a frustrated people through 40 years in a dry wasteland. A change from trusting God to being impatient with God. Moses went through several stages of change and changes in the 40 years between the Red Sea in Exodus 13 and Mount Nebo in Deuteronomy 34. Upon reflection, during this period of grieving, the Israelites grieved for Moses in the plains of Moab. Upon reflection, during this period of our grieving, there were many phases, not only of Moses' life, to think through and to fathom. It is the same with Mandela. Upon reflection, during our period of grieving, there are many phases of Madiba's life to think through and to fathom. The Mandela of capitalism and globalization in 2013 is not the same as the Mandela of the Freedom Charter in 1955. Mandela changed. As a matter of documented and self-identified fact in his autobiography, Madiba went through several stages of change in his many years of iconic leadership. From the Youth League of the ANC with Walter Sisulu to the negotiated settlement with the racist Afrikaner government, Madiba changed. From embracing the Freedom Charter, which advocated for the radical redistribution of wealth and income, to the embracing of a program of neoliberal capitalism and protection of Western corporate wealth and white South African interests, Madiba changed. While political apartheid ended, economic apartheid in a different color and guise was born and put firmly into place. In the words of Anthony Matero, quote, with the exception of a few black multi-millionaires, a sidebar of the negotiated settlement called Black Economic Empowerment, and with the exception of a small black middle class of professionals and government workers, the suffering of the working black masses and the poor in South Africa has become even more desperate. From a revolutionary to being embraced by global forces of counter-revolutionary, embraced by the very people who are the enemies of the poor he once fought so valiantly to protect. Madiba changed. But as those in the plains of Moab grieved, remembered, and reflected on the life of Moses in its totality, they did not stop loving him and honoring him for his many years of service. Neither do we in our period of grieving, remembering, and reflecting. Neither do we stop loving Madiba and honoring Madiba for his many years of sacrifice and commitment. We mourn the loss of his marriages, and we honor the women who stood beside him and who had to raise their children without him. Evelyn Massey, who took their children back home to her father. We honor Winnie Mandela for her steadfast commitment to the poor in Alexandra, in Khayelitsha, in Langa, in Guguletu. We bless her for the many years when she carried the ethics and the principles of the ANC on her back with no husband to lie down beside every night. And we also express our love and gratitude to Madiba for all he tried to do for his people and for this world of ours. But articulating our love, articulating our respect, and articulating our gratitude to Madiba is only the penultimate act of grief. Demonstrating our love, demonstrating our respect, and demonstrating our gratitude is the ultimate act of healthy grieving, or what psychologists, psychotherapists, and pastoral counselors call good grief. Moses is dead in Deuteronomy 34. What do we do now? How do we demonstrate our love, our respect, and our gratitude? Read that passage again. By getting up from the plains of Moab and marching on across the Jordan till victory is won. Moses didn't get to the promised land with the community of the covenant, but God let him see it. Madiba did not get to the promises of the Freedom Charter, but God gave him a glimpse of how life could be and how life should be. So now it is up to us to have good grief. It is up to us to get up from this period of mourning. It is up to us to go beyond remembering and reflecting to rededication. Let us rededicate ourselves to the principles and the promises of the Freedom Charter. Let us march on beyond Moab in memory of Madiba. Let us march on until the Freedom Charter in Cliptown in stone becomes a living reality in the flesh, where number one, the people shall govern. That's the Freedom Charter. Let us march on until number two, all national groups shall have equal rights. Let us march on until number three, all the people shall share in the country's wealth. Let us march on until number four, the land shall be shared among those who work the land. Let us march on until number five, all shall be equal before the Lord. Let's march on until number six, all shall enjoy equal human rights. Let us march on until number seven, there shall be work and security. Let us march on until number eight, the doors of learning and culture shall be open for all. Let us march on until number nine, there shall be houses, security, and comfort. Let us march on until number 10, there is true peace and friendship. The 1955 Freedom Charter ends with these words: these freedoms we will fight for side by side, black, white, colored, Indian, Asian, Malay. We will fight for these freedoms side by side throughout our lives until we have won our liberty. Let us march on, James Weldon Johnson says, until victory is won. The battle ain't over yet. Let us march on. Madiba is gone, but we have not gotten to where he was leading us. Let us march on, people of South Africa. Let us march on. South Africans on the continent, South Africans who are expatriates, let us march on. People of God and people of conscience, let us march on. people of God and people of faith, let us march on. Those who call him Modimo, those who call him Unkulunkulu, those who call him Mawe, Nyame, Olorun, Olodirame, Yahweh, Allah, and Oshala, let us march on together, side by side. Let us march on until gun violence and gang violence are wiped from the streets of our city. Let us march on until black unemployment is no more and a living wage is guaranteed for every human being. Let us march on till mass incarceration is in place with meaningful education and replaced with mass immigration. Let us march on till all women are treated with dignity, with respect, and with genuine care. R. Kelly, Wheezy, Rick Ross, holler if you hear me. Let us march on until health care is made available for the poor. Let us march on till no child goes to bed hungry any place on this planet at night. Let us march on until the Palestinians can live at peace in their own home. Let us march on till the wall of apartheid in Jerusalem comes down like the wall of apartheid came down in Johannesburg. Let us march on until drones are destroyed and negotiation replaces the threat of nuclear annihilation. Let us march on until reconciliation replaces revenge. Let us march on until hope triumphs over hate. Siyabonga! Siyabonga! Siyabonga!
The Reverend Dr. Jeremiah Wright, everybody. Let's give him a great hand.